everyone, welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and my guest today is Kermit Blackwood. Kermit is a writer, he's a musician, he's a graphic novelist, and he's also a steward of land and animals. Welcome, Kermit.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. I love this show.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. A fan.
I am.
Yay.
For sure.
So, Kermit, you've been here in the area for how many years?
I moved here in 1994.
94, so you've been here a while. Yes. And you grew up in California, rural, very rural California, on a ranch.
I grew up on the Honeywell Ranch.
Uh-huh.
It's on both sides of the Nevada and the California border. We lived in the Nevada side of the ranch in the winter, in the California side quite a bit higher up during the summers. It's a working horse and cattle ranch.
Uh-huh. Was it like being in two different climates? That's a lot of difference in elevation.
Not so much, just not as high up.
Yeah, yes.
A little bit wetter up in the California side.
Did you like it? Did you like growing up on a ranch?
I loved growing up on the Honeywell Ranch. I loved the landscape, the incredible vistas, growing up right on the Sawtooth Ridge. But it wasn't always that wonderful. The folks weren't always very nice.
Do you mean the community? The surrounding community? Going to school?
Yeah, just the surrounding community and everybody that didn't live right in a town. We didn't live in the downtown area of any of the number of towns that went to the same schools. So you would bus in. And they just, this was the 70s and people were racist. It's pretty simple. So.
And did you have compatriots? Did you make friends? No?
Oh, certainly. I had quite a few good friends, but I didn't have anybody of my own race or ethnicity. So there was no one to identify with at that level.
Right.
But the American Indian kids were very welcoming, and I never felt that there was any difference between us. And that simply wasn't the case with pretty much any of the kids other than right on our ranch that I would interact with. There was always very preoccupied with race. Everyone was. It seemed to me.
And so that's sort of the information that you got when you went out into the town, or
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's what it was like for you.
Kids weren't allowed to play, things like that.
Yeah, so that set you apart a bit.
Oh yeah.
Your feelings about yourself and your relationship to other people would be formed in that way as well.
Absolutely. My formative years were there on the ranch, and the ranch itself is very isolated. It's a historic ranch. The family is a very well-respected family, but the rude awakening that one experiences when going to a horse show or a sports game, like at a high school, where they would have competitions in sports, things like that, where young people can be really awful, kids can be.
They can be.
But oftentimes it would be an adult. I thought my name was the N-bomb until I was about 11. People really did refer to me in these kinds of terms. And if you grew up with it, it really wasn't that insulting. It was just a number of nicknames that I didn't like.
Right. When did that change for you?
When I left. When I left, I no longer, I had no idea that everyone wasn't that racist. I really didn't. I thought that what I had experienced was everybody's experience. That small microcosm of the world was representative of any other place. I think it's pretty unique to small towns in the Sierras, maybe.
At that time.
Yeah, sure. Before cable. Before people saw people of color in their living room.
Yes. Coming out of high school, or maybe even in high school, you started getting into music a bit.
Yeah. Identity. I really was unhappy not having peers or feeling like I had any sort of sense of self or worth. And music television, MTV, had become a thing, and dancing and singing were suddenly, I grew up with country western. I knew exactly what music was, but everything that I saw reinforced my otherness.
Yeah.
I could never be a real cowboy, even though I was a real cowboy, in the sense that I was living on a ranch, living a cowboy lifestyle. But no one could ever see me in that world. listening to these other kinds of music and what have you, I began to identify with it, and I ended up attracting the attention of another young person who was a very gifted keyboard player, and who was multiracial. His mother was white, his father was black. His father was a well-known jazz musician, and his mother was a radio personality, evangelical. And he introduced me to R&B and pop music, which I was not really that familiar with. And I had some interactions with some other things, but he's the one who really brought me into the music fold. And through the NAACP competition, we won. So long story short, we were on a lot of different competitions around, and I don't know how, but we won. So, and I was I'm a little embarrassed, but I was a dancer, and it was the day of, people were popping, and I didn't pop and I didn't break dance. I did my own thing. I think it was very Michael Jackson inspired, but I was also inspired by The System and Shalimar. A lot of cool things that I found interesting, not necessarily just whatever my friend had introduced me to. But so I found music, and music found me, and I had a manager by the time I was about 15.
Wow.
And we were booked in a lot of things, and I say unfortunately, but I had a little bit of a modeling career. It wasn't something that I wanted to do, but it was, when you're a little kid and somebody wants you to do Benetton, it seemed like a really good idea.
Sure.
So suddenly I had something, and going back to the identity, a lot of things that I did so that people back home who were so awful to me would see that I mattered.
Yeah.
Can you see me now? Can you see me? And of course they didn't see me. So eventually that art became something for me and for art's reasons, but I think initially it really was I'm better than what you think I am. I'm somebody.
And you also, for your own self, I would think you had a container. You were able to be this. You were able to dance and to sing and to act. And that gave you. I would think it would give you. Something to move in. That was comfortable.
Yeah. And it had a shape, it had a form, it had marks on the floor, some tape, notes to hit. It seemed like a good idea. And I remember growing up on the ranch, they'd have these square dances, and I just hated them. And I hated just the whole format. And I just don't know exactly what it was that rubbed me wrong. But once I was involved in this little pop world, I appreciated the choreography, and I appreciated that there were these different sort of areas on the stage that each person involved themselves in.
And you were learning new skills as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And working with people, which must have been comforting.
Oh my gosh, and really cool people. I look back at it now, I'm just like, wow, they were really cool. And I'm good friends with many of them to this very day, so I think I did okay. I didn't burn any bridges. I'm sure I burned a few.
Well, you mentioned when we talked before that you happened often to be in the right place at the right time. And was it during that period of time as well?
It's a funny thing. When I was in the 80s in LA, people called me Chauncey because of being there. Chauncey's gardener. So he was this bit of an idiot who just was always in the right place, and people went to that person for advice. And I really was that person, and I think it's pretty bizarre, but I seem to always have an unusual, there was just some reason I would be in the right place at the right time.
After a little bit of a whirlwind in show business, and this is California, I assume, somehow you ended up at Marlboro College. How did that happen?
I had hit a wall. I had had a reinvention of careers 3 times since I arrived in show business. And I'd had a lot more success than a lot of people in each one, and blew a lot of opportunities as well, because I just wasn't interested in a lot of things I should have been. But the last time that a whole body of work that I had worked, I had co-written an entire album. It would be my 3rd album that I had co-written and co-produced, and it was rejected by the powers that be. It wasn't commercial enough, it was too eclectic, and I really wanted to sing about apartheid, and they were just not having it. I was told I wasn't Bob Marley by one person. I was told by a number of people that my job was to be pretty. That's what people expected of me, to shake my butt, and it really angered me. And I was doing a lot of soul searching, and I just didn't want to be in LA anymore. I always wanted to be a biologist. One of my favorite books was Island Biogeography by Robert MacArthur. Evolution, evolutionary processes, speciation. These are things that have always been very interesting to me. I've always maintained a collection of animals of sorts, a garden, and traveled whenever I can, and saw things, and have made very good colleagues that are involved with these kinds of things, animals or conservation or both. And I started working for the WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, because of my work with these land fowl, birds related to chickens. I've had a long success with raising some very rare and endangered species. And so I had volunteered at the LA Zoo under the curator of birds there. I volunteered for a few years. And then I got a paid job as a curator's intern at the WCS. And from there I realized, they helped me realize after a couple of years, I needed to go to college and get a degree.
And you're in your 20s by now?
Yes, I was a 26-year-old freshman. So I arrived at Marlboro as a 26-year-old, and I was old.
Yeah, and you came to Marlboro from California, so what drew you to Vermont in particular?
I was in New York at the WCS, which is based
see.
out of the Bronx Zoo. I applied at a couple of different colleges, and I was accepted by a few, but the only one that really grabbed me was Marlboro. I loved it. It was a tiny little campus. Always wanted to go to Vermont because of maple syrup and leaves, and the few Vermonters I'd ever met were really cool. And I'd also met people who weren't from Vermont but who had lived there. So Vermont was just like this cool un-America, America, you know. And I always wanted to live, I'm a country boy.
Yeah, right.
Where could I live in the country where people weren't awful? You know?
Right,
And maybe even
right.
I could be a part of a community and not just somebody who lived there.
Right.
So I went to Marlboro, and one of the reasons that I wanted to study, well, Robert MacArthur, who wrote Island Biogeography, was one of the founders of the college.
Oh, that's Marlboro MacArthur. Oh, I
Yes.
didn't realize that.
Yes. And his brother taught there. He was a professor of mine. I was totally inspired by Bob Engel. Yeah, so I went to that school and I built my aviary and studied my birds from the Himalayas in the wintertime, and nobody had ever been able to study them in the winter.
Wow.
So I was able to and learned quite a lot about them, and I just stuck around. I met most of my very best friends there. I can't say as I ever really had real friends until I moved here. I wasn't maybe emotionally intelligent enough or enough of myself. I hadn't
You were
had
busy.
a sense of person.
You're in show business.
Yeah, being anything but myself. So here in Vermont, I learned a lot more about who I am, and I think a lot through the friends that I made here.
Yeah. And you, did you start really getting specific studying birds in particular?
When I was a little kid, I would ask, where did I come from? And they say, you hatched. And I just had an affinity for actually dinosaurs. I liked dinosaurs. I was not interested in little birds. Magpies maybe, but pheasants, peafowl, herons, cranes, large things. I liked quite a lot. And I had a relationship with a peacock at a very young age, and it was my dragon. And that creature blew my mind in so many ways. And then everything that I read really didn't match what it was as a fellow creature who lived on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, traveling through the buckbrush and seeing things at the same time together. I felt that if Rikki Tikki Tavi or one of these children's books that I had read had a better peafowl character, people would be more appreciative of this bird that people were describing in terms that really didn't seem to have anything to do with the bird itself. So I became very interested in really animal behavior, animal communication. So how one species communicates to another, and the peafowl, not in its modality of showing off finery and plumage, but rather something quite a bit more subtle in how they communicate to other creatures that they're not profitable prey. And so that's where I started my academic career, and it continues.
studying animals especially, you're really watching, you're really listening, you're really observing, and you're thinking a lot about what's going on and the relationships between them.
And you learn. I've worked with some really amazing people that I've read their papers and all these things, and then I actually interacted with them, like George Schaller, Ellen Darenfeld, Dan Wharton, George Barrowclough, all these people that, unless you're in this world, you wouldn't know who they are, but they're huge if you are in that and you're reading these papers, and they help you with critical thinking skills. Christine Shepard and Don Bruning, I should never forget. They help you read a paper, and you can always go back to that paper. It's like a great album. You can go back to it, and it'll still be wonderful. And you can extrapolate on it. You can say, I saw a hole in the thinking here, and I'd like to, think a little bit more about that. And I think that that's my niche, because I'm not a hard scientist. I never was particularly mathematically inclined. And then in college, I was in a bad car accident, and I had severe bruising on my brain, and it greatly changed my ability to look at things in an analytical sense. I couldn't tie knots. I grew up on a horse ranch. Couldn't cinch a saddle. Still really have a hard time with it. Or a halter would be difficult. Worked as a lifeguard. I really don't know my stroke anymore. Any of my swim strokes. And playing instruments is pretty much impossible.
Really?
I'm beginning to play the bass. I was never a great musician, but enough that I could collaborate easily.
How has that affected you? I mean, it's giving you, it's sort of putting you in a different arena of what you can do and what you enjoy doing, and leaving behind a lot of what you...
Well, it was devastating, because the first thing that happened is I didn't have a support network at the college, and I was out here, and then you're in denial that there's anything wrong with you. And I think I look back now, it was in '97, and I look back now and I recognize things about myself that changed. And so this new sense of identity and sense of purpose and self, I warped them much as I had in show business. I just put on this new thing. And not having this reputation as I had in show business, where I walk in the door and everyone's like, yay, or then when in working at as a naturalist and having a good reputation and people appreciating your ideas and what have you. After college, I really quit. I couldn't draw anymore. I couldn't think about these things. And so I just completely abandoned this thing that had become so passionate. And I also didn't have music. So I had a bit of an identity crisis, and it took a number of years for me to catch up with it and recognize what was really going on.
You have a little media company called Megapode, and you write graphic novels.
Yeah, I'm writing a graphic novel, 2 actually.
So did this open up for you as another means of expression when you weren't able to do music?
What happened is you just keep plugging away. And the realization that I made, a director had told me that what I needed to do with this big Egyptian opus that I had written, that several people have optioned and given me accolades and some money for over the years. So you need to direct this. And I remember that felt like a punch in the head, because I really needed the finances. I needed money. I needed to, to grow as an adult. I needed this project to do something. And he told me that, and I was so insulted. And then I started seeing little things, and I realized I could direct it myself. I couldn't direct it as a cable series or as a film, but I could do it as an interactive graphic novel. I no longer really feel that confident drawing myself, but I could collaborate with artists. And so that's what I did. And the music, I collaborated with some folks who were really good at music, some of whom I've worked with for years in music. And so we were able to create soundscapes. So then also I was in a whole new medium and really loving it.
And it's called The Station of No Station?
Yes, that's what the greater story is. And the very first installation of it is called The Widow of the Pharaoh. It's about Tutankhamun, the 18th dynasty. And when, at the crossroads in time, when women lost their power, as it was usurped by an organized patriarchal religious structure.
And it's interactive, you said?
It is.
Yes. So is it live?
It isn't live, but what you can do is you can, like in a video game, you can participate as any of the characters. You can see what they're seeing, and there are themes, musical themes that go with each character or storyline, and you can then pick on what are called Easter eggs and visit and look into the actual historic record. It is historic fiction, so you can read deeper into the material.
Well, sounds great.
I hope so.
Yeah, it sounds very exciting. You've been part of the local food movement to a certain degree. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Because of my ethnicity, people in rural places don't generally assume that I am a country boy. They think I'm from the city. And here in Vermont, I've even heard people say, "Oh, that he's a flatlander," And I grew up, well up in the Sierras, much higher than any mountains here in Vermont. So, but I'm country, and I grew up that way, obviously. So, animal husbandry is a big part of what I do in who I am. And the local food movement, I started with the different foundations, but my favorite one is the Cabbage Hill Farm Foundation. While I was in college, I started to collaborate with Nancy Kohlberg, talking about heritage breeds, and this foundation was created, and one of the main emphases were to import endangered livestock and breeds, and then in interfacing with that, I realized what the problems were. Excuse me, and a part of that was that it hadn't really been defined well as to what it was that was an endangered breed. And then the idea of, well, any breed that was industrial lived, and anything pre-industrial died out. And so really that had to be tackled. And this is before there was a local food movement. So I convinced the Kohlbergs into opening the Flying Pig restaurant in Mount Kisco, New York. I wasn't the only person, but it was my idea. And I named it as well. And lots of much more capable people made it happen. I'm not the executor. But they did open a very successful restaurant, and a lot of my ideas were utilized. And I certainly wasn't the only person in the world thinking about these kinds of things. And so in watching that, I saw the good and the bad, and how it could be improved upon. And then here in Vermont, my good friends up here, we have a little bit of a farm cooperative up there in Townsend and Wyndham and West Townsend. And so we're working towards that end as well. There's a West River Community Center that is the center of its operation is at the West Townsend Cafe. That's where the post office is. There's a lot of really fun stuff going on there. On Fridays there's a farmer's market. But at this very moment, I am excited. There's a Wyndham Grows and Food Connects and all these really interesting things happening. And so I'm working with farmers and chefs, bringing them all together and really creating a taste of place, because that's what's missing. So that's what I'm just super excited about, is helping a farmer make a living by using what they're doing in a new way. Don't try and make that sandwich. Make something that's unique, that only you are making or that business is making, and really encapsulate that place's unique taste.
Right. And so you've been pretty hands-on with this. Is that right?
Yeah, at times. If I'm working on something, I can't be. But.
There's a great quote that I wanted to get into the show. And I think you said this, I'm not sure. To be a chicken collector is to be a cultural historian. Was that you?
Yes, I think it was me. Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, sure.
Which came first is the question.
Oh, right.
Right?
The egg, for certain. The way that the transportation of livestock happens is fascinating. And now with mitogenomics, we can look at the iron, the Iron Age of Germany, and we can find the pig bones and take the DNA and learn where that pig was domesticated and where it had been moved and what have you. With chickens, it's really fascinating because we thought they were just all native to Southeast Asia, and for the most part they are, but the way they've been moved from Indonesia to Oceania to the Pacific to South America, they're just fascinating. And there's a couple of different wild species that are the ancestors of chickens, just as there are a few species of cows, wild cows, that became domestic cattle.
That's right.
So you're a cultural conservationist, I guess, when you understand the different strata of time and history and understand how important this food basket was and how these different plants and animals were transported in time. And the chicken really requires a lot of stewardship, or it did until industrialism. So people didn't just throw things together. The ranch I grew up on, the chickens had been there for a long time. There wasn't mongrelization going on. There was a line was maintained. They couldn't just order something new. So with chickens, you can learn quite a lot about who the people were. When they arrived in a particular place, chickens weren't native there.
Yeah.
And so where those chickens came from tells you a lot about the history.
Interesting. That's very interesting. You know, Kermit, of all the many things you've done, you know, I mean, you've been a collaborator you've been a collaborator often. You've been a performer, you've been an historian, you've done a lot of studying, you've been a musician, and I'm sure that this has changed over the course of your life, but where do you feel, where do you feel most happy, or where do you feel most satisfied? Or what's exciting to you?
Elizabeth Warren. I'm really excited with where America is right now. I'm glad that as a 50-year-old, I'm finally seeing in America where people are comfortable talking about race. They're comfortable talking about sexuality, class, things that were just too difficult to discuss. And it is positively reaffirming to see Americans really rise to that occasion and make something, to grow. I'm happiest in seeing things evolve. I like the local food movement, sustainable agriculture, and these kinds of things. My emphasis in the world is I would really like to see more happen with indigenous peoples in the United States and all over the world.
All over the world, yeah.
But in America, the indigenous peoples of this hemisphere absolutely deserve much more emphasis. This whole America is a country of migrants is really insulting and hurtful to hear over and over again to people living on a reservation. And I'm happiest in the projects that I collaborate with my Indians back home. I have some projects going on back there.
Back in California?
Yeah. And I also find artists always are a huge inspiration, so I will always maintain that. And I guess I'm just really inspired right now with what I'm seeing, with people really just putting themselves out there, like Elizabeth Warren. I can think of a whole lot of people, but of course my brain isn't working right now, but there's just so many people who are putting things down and in a way that you can really understand it and making it very comprehensible.
Yes.
What that word is.
And young people too.
Oh,
right?
sure.
That's what's so exciting.
The Z generation are very exciting.
Is it Z? Is that what it is now?
I think that's what they call them. They're my favorites. Yeah.
Where can you go from there if you're the Z generation?
Oh, I know. It's scary. After Trump. Woo.
Well, Kermit, this was fun.
Yes, it was.
It was great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
You've got so many things going on.
I had a great time.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that. Thanks to all of you for joining us today and getting to know Kermit Blackwood a little bit better. We will have information at the end of the show for some of his projects, so stay tuned for that. And we'll see you next week.